I really just think there's a lot of intergenerational sexual shame.
What's your carnal theory?
How do you see people starting to mentally break this stigma down and like reflect upon it and deal with it?
So I believe that people aren't really confronted with even breaking down stigma until they really know someone who says, hey, I have herpes, or I have cold sores and that's herpes too, or a friend that discloses, or a partner that says, hey, by the way, when was your last STI screening? And by the way, I have herpes, so I just want you to know before we engage. So my personal experience and from chatting with others is that you're not confronting it until you have to, right? We live in this place of ignorance, and it's not necessarily our fault because, as you said, it's a systemic issue. We've got sex education that is often lacking. Even more comprehensive sex ed still could bolster itself up with regard to narratives around STIs. You've got legislation and policy that aren't inclusive to all populations and specifically limit access to more marginalized populations. And our country has a history of presuming, especially women specifically, are the carriers of STIs. So there's an added stigma there. And then you just have your friends and your media groups that kind of reinforce each other from what you see on television. How often do we see a show on television that doesn't put herpes as a joke, but rather invites people into a conversation that it's a real human thing that happens to a million people every day?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that there's obviously a number of issues that face us in 2020 and have for a while. And I think that so many of them just miss that link of getting humanized. And climate change comes to mind. Like, we think of this as this something other. And when we start to humanize it, that's actually a part of our story. We start to go like, oh, I know climate change. Oh, I know STIs. Like, it becomes, when you make it human, when you make it personal, people start to be like, all right, so maybe we need to deal with this. Maybe we need to look at this. Do you think that lack of communication education directly contributes to STIs continuing to spread?
It's so funny you say that, because I was thinking about that recently. And I do think that that's part of it. And I also think that mandated testing plays a role in that as well. And, I just made a post today on different types of herpes tests and screenings and things like that. But the CDC doesn't include that in STI screening, in your regular all-inclusive test. And there are several reasons for that. But there are arguments and people go back and forth. And even I go back and forth with myself in my head sometimes about, should herpes be included? Because everyone does pretty much have one kind of herpes. The psychological impact is a lot with the stigma. But I also think it would really encourage conversation and help to normalize it as something like, oh, like, it's just herpes. Like, I'd love to get to that point where I'm surrounded by people or receive messages that say, I'm in this place where I feel like it's just herpes, like, it's okay. But yeah, I do think that plays a role.
I mean, everyone's always shocked when they find out that they haven't been tested for herpes. The vast majority of people, even if you've had STI testing done, you haven't been tested for herpes. I can almost guarantee it. I even had an argument the other day with a gal online. It was a friendly argument, someone I knew from school who follows my work and supports what I'm doing. And she's like, oh yeah, I'm pretty sure I got tested for a bunch of stuff when I was pregnant. And I was like, well, you didn't get tested for herpes. And she was like, yeah. And I looked it up. She's in a different country right now. And I looked up what the country recommendations were and what the routine screening was for pregnant women. And it wasn't herpes. And so I sent it to her and I said, that's a common misconception. And she's like, oh, I thought it was like, because it's such a huge risk for pregnancy. I'm like, well, that's also a common misconception. It's a risk, but it's not as huge as you might assume. And it's only for certain circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. And so people really even push back when you tell them the facts and the information, like, no, I know I don't have herpes and I've been tested. And it's like, no, you actually probably haven't, because they're not doing that. And so to answer your question with this really long story, it's part of it is the efficacy of the tests, and herpes tests in particular, depending on the timing of tests, you can get a lot of false negatives. You can also, depending on the type of test that's being administered, you can get a false positive. There are some gold standard tests out there, but they're also not cheap. So the procedural process, the testing modality is not accessible in terms of healthcare. Right now, they don't feel like it's a giant need because basically the vast majority of people have some form of herpes, type 1 or type 2. So there's a few reasons around herpes, but that is similar to some of these other tests. Either the tests themselves are not the efficacy of the test is in question. The test pricing and accessibility is rare and not advantageous from a healthcare business perspective.
Why do you think that genital herpes tends to carry a higher stigma when so many people have oral herpes? Well, I'll start there and then maybe we can get into testing for a second.
So I think it goes back to the post that you referenced in just our society's discomfort with the genitals. Like you said, we're getting genital about it, and just sex. And, we're in America, we're such a sex saturated culture, very provocative and people engaging in sex every day, all the time. Fine. But when you confront the vulnerable side of sex, the side that isn't presented in the media, the STIs, the awkward conversations, the awkward sex noises, the stuff that you don't want to see when you're watching a movie or porn, the non-romanticized version of sex. It's this fantasy versus reality in my mind. But I really just think there's a lot of intergenerational sexual shame.
Before we wrap up, I want to ask one more question, which is that a lot of people will assume if they're in a monogamous relationship and then their partner is diagnosed with herpes or an STI, that it means that they're not faithful or that they have cheated on them. Is that true?
No. So I'll speak to herpes specifically here because it's so difficult with testing and it's hard to navigate. It's hard to know when you have it because most people don't have a testing history. Most people don't know they have it. Up to 90% of people have no idea that they have it because it's largely asymptomatic or they mistake it for razor burn or ingrown hairs. You're not tested for it. So how would you know? And you could have a partner who has cold sores, not know that that's herpes and that it could be transmitted genitally during oral sex. So there are a lot of possibilities within monogamous relationships that a herpes diagnosis can arise that doesn't automatically mean that someone was cheating on you or went astray.
Carnal Theory is produced by My Sex Bio. Our sound design is by Audrey Cohane, and our theme music by Min the Universe. My Sex Bio is an educational platform built to empower people like you to take command of your sexual biography. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, TikTok, YouTube, and Spotify at My Sex Bio. Visit our website and join our e-letter at mysexbio.org and support our work by joining our Patreon. Thank you.